Hello, this is Mr. Dykes here, and today we're going to be talking about the Articles of Confederation, its weaknesses, and how Shays' Rebellion contributed to showing these weaknesses a lot. The Articles themselves was originally written in 1777 at the First Continental Congress. Although it wasn't ratified until 1781, it was the Constitution and how the government was formed in the United States for approximately 12 years. So, there's a lot of time for that, the weaknesses of it to really show, which is we're going to elaborate on later on in the video. The primary focus of it was on limiting the powers of the central government. There was only one branch of government, and even then that branch is not as it is today. There was no president, which means that there's no executive branch, no judicial branch, which means there's no Supreme Court. And the legislative branch only comprised of one body, which was the Senate. Because today there's two, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Under this, there's only one. The members of the Senate themselves was chosen by state legislature, the state governments themselves. They were appointed and pushed up, which kind of shows that they were ultimately just messengers for the state legislators themselves, so everyone knew what was happening and was essentially on the same page, one might describe it. So under this, the government itself had the powers to declare war and make peace, coin money, and borrow money, which coin money essentially means that they could make money, really. And they could watch over the trade with Native Americans and appoint officers of the U.S. Army. Now, to think about how they could appoint officers of the U.S. Army is really ironic when you think about it, because there was no U.S. Army. The Army itself was comprised of state militias, because Congress did not have the power to make national armed forces. They couldn't make an army and navy or anything like that. I guess that they presumed that in a time of need or any conflict that might happen in the future, that the states would just provide them, and that would be the end of it. So the fact that they could appoint officers, but the officers didn't have an army to serve, doesn't really make sense. But they did change it, so they realized they couldn't levy taxes, which means they couldn't tax a lot at all, and they couldn't watch over the trade among the states itself, which is called commerce. They couldn't regulate commerce and the goods going in and out of each state and how they're associating with each other and stuff like that. To amend the articles, it needed all 13 states to agree on the amendment being presented. Which amendments are pretty much things that would happen to add on to the Constitution for more clarification in some cases, new laws to be enacted that would pertain to the current day and age that it's in. Because the Constitution itself, even the articles, was meant to be a flexible document and adapt to each time period and adapt for the future, however it's needed to. But it needed all of the states. So that's at that time, there's only 13, so that's why it says on all 13. Today, they only need 2/3. Excuse me. There's 2/3 majority vote in the Congress itself is needed to pass an amendment. And 2/3 is, if there are 30 members, which there are a lot more than 30, but this is just an illustration, an example, they would need 20 people, 20 representatives, senators, depends on which house we're talking about in today's government. We need 20 of them to agree with the amendment and like it, you might say, in order for it to be passed. Now, Shays' Rebellion is one thing that really accelerated the calls to reform and change the Articles of Confederation and make it to where the government is a lot better and actually can be called an effective government. The Shays' Rebellion was led by Captain Daniel Shays, which he was, there's a title captain in there because he was an officer in the Continental Army whenever the revolution was going on. And he, along with other members, was discharged, and they said that the government said that they were going to get paid for their service, but they never really did. At one time, the government made it to where they can get a little bit for 1 month's pay, and then they just were given government script or something like that wasn't really good for anything. They wanted really real money because there was debt collectors coming in and foreclosing on their houses because the U.S. was in a very, very big financial crisis and bad financial time at that in the early days of the United States because of all the debt that they had from the revolution itself. They needed some way to pay it, so that's what they decided to do. And this got all the people angry, and the former veterans, former militiamen, caused them to organize a mob under Daniel Shays himself. And ultimately, they did a lot of things, but one of the final things that they did was they approached the Springfield, Massachusetts Armory in an attempt to get weapons to revolt against the foreclosures and the lack of them being paid and things like that. But the Continental Army and the militias, state militias of Massachusetts, knew that they were going to do this, so they were waiting and ready for them to come and approach. So they fired artillery warning shots at the mob, you might call them. And in those warning shots, or shots, however many there was 4 killed and 20 wounded. And this caused the mob to really disperse and scatter, which most of them were eventually caught and forgiven. Acquitted is a term that they use of the crime that they committed. But this really showed how weak the government was, the bad financial time that they were in, and it really pushed the calls for like I mentioned a lot, to reform the Articles of Confederation, which they did, as we can tell, because we have a new government today, a new government system than they did then, under the Constitution, which was drafted in the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. So that is the Articles of Confederation, its weaknesses, and how Shays' Rebellion contributed.